It was November of 1888. The wind across the plains of western Nebraska had no opinion on the matter. It was simply cold, a dry and scouring cold that found its way through the threadbare wool of Abigail's coat. She held the iron key to the sod house in her palm, its metal a dead thing, colder than the air. Her twin sister, Martha, stood beside her, clutching a single burlap sack that held their mother's ledger, a book on botany, and a thin volume of poetry. It was everything they had been allowed to keep. The dirt street was empty. The sky was the color of slate. The man from the bank, Mr. Hemlock, adjusted his hat, his face impassive. He had the deed in his hand, a piece of paper that had undone their entire world. He was not a cruel man. He was simply a man who followed the rules written on such papers. He looked at the two 18-year-old girls, their faces pale in the flat, grey light. He saw a problem that was no longer his to solve. He cleared his throat, the sound swallowed by the wind. "The debt is the debt," he said. "The law has no room for sentiment." He turned and walked away, his boots making crisp sounds on the frozen ground. Abigail's fingers tightened around the key, the cold of it a final, sharp truth. The house was behind them. The town was behind them. Ahead was only the immense, indifferent prairie and the line of distant, skeletal trees along the creek. Inside the burlap sack, beneath the books, lay a small, sealed tin of seeds. It was their mother's private collection, seeds for plants that had no business growing in Nebraska, and it was the most impossible thing they owned. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we follow this key, this ledger, and these two sisters into the heart of a winter that did not care if they survived. Their parents had not been failures. They had simply been unlucky, which in the vast emptiness of the plains, was often the same thing. Their father, a quiet man with calloused hands, understood soil and sky. Their mother understood the smaller, more intricate world of plants, keeping a detailed ledger of everything she grew, everything she foraged, and everything she learned from the earth. It was a book of observations, not accounts. It spoke of how chickweed tasted after the first frost, how yarrow could be used to staunch a cut, and how the inner bark of a slippery elm could soothe a raw throat. Abigail and Martha were born into this world of quiet competence. But they were not identical in their curiosities. Abigail inherited her mother's love for the written word, for the order and promise held within the pages of a book. She read the almanacs until the paper grew soft, memorizing frost dates and moon cycles. She consumed the botany text, learning the Latin names for plants her fingers had never touched. To her, knowledge was a structure, a framework upon which a life could be built. She believed that if you understood the principles, you could solve the problem. Martha, however, learned with her hands and her eyes. She inherited her father's quiet observation. While Abigail read about root systems, Martha was digging them up, noting the texture of the soil, the way the fine tendrils clung to certain types of rock. She could tell by the lean of the trees which way the prevailing wind blew. She knew the sound of a dry branch before it snapped underfoot. She could read the story of a season in the rings of a fallen cottonwood. She believed that principles were useless until you had felt the problem with your own skin. This division of labor, this partnership of mind and material, was the engine of their childhood. But in the small, tightly wound community of Prairie Ridge, it was seen as something else. It was seen as odd. Girls were meant to learn sewing, cooking, and the art of running a household. They were not meant to be studying fungal spores or calculating the caloric value of cattail roots. The townswomen watched them. They saw girls who preferred the silence of the creek bed to the chatter of the church social. They saw hands stained with dirt and ink, not flour. Mrs. Gable, a woman whose opinion carried the weight of communal consensus, once remarked to their mother over a shared fence line, her voice a mixture of pity and disapproval. "It ain't natural for girls to be so occupied with weeds and numbers. A woman's mind should be on her home, not on the wilderness that surrounds it." The word stung because they were not meant to be cruel. They were meant to be a warning. The world had a shape, and the sisters did not fit within it. Their parents ignored the whispers, creating a small island of acceptance for their daughters. But the island was washed away in the spring of 1888. A fever, swift and merciless, took their father in 3 days and their mother 2 days later. It left the sisters with a small farm, a mountain of debt secured by men who had smiled at their father on Sunday, and a profound, echoing silence. They tried. For 6 months, they worked the land with the fierce, desperate energy of the newly orphaned. Abigail planned. Martha executed. They brought in a modest harvest. But it was not enough. The debt, as Mr. Hemlock had said, was the debt. The bank foreclosed. The community looked on, their faces a mixture of sympathy and a quiet, grim satisfaction. The world had corrected itself. The strange experiment on the edge of town was over. This is how they found themselves standing in the frozen street, holding a useless key and a bag of books, the inciting event not a single moment of dramatic loss, but the quiet, bureaucratic turning of a page in a ledger they were not allowed to see. The system had no category for them. So, it erased them. The first night, they slept in a dry irrigation ditch, huddled together for warmth. The cold was a physical presence, a weight that pressed down on them. It was not malicious. It was simply the state of things. The temperature dropped to 15 degrees. Shivering was a constant, a violent, full-body tremor that consumed what little energy they had. They ate nothing. There was nothing to eat. By the third day, the hunger was a dull, persistent ache in their bellies. The cold had settled deeper, into their bones. They followed the frozen creek, reasoning that water meant life, even if that water was currently a sheet of grey ice. Martha, her eye scanning the barren landscape, spotted a cluster of rose hips, shriveled and hard on a thorny bush. They were nearly tasteless, but they were something. They filled their pockets, rationing the small, hard berries. Each one was a negotiation with starvation. Their first shelter was a shallow overhang of rock, a place where the wind could not directly strike them. It was better than the open ditch, but not by much. The stone floor leached the warmth from their bodies faster than they could generate it. Sleep came in brief, shivering fits, punctuated by waking dreams of warm bread and hot stew. The dizziness started on the 5th day. Standing up too quickly brought a black wave that threatened to pull them under. Abigail, the planner, felt a cold knot of despair. Her books had not prepared her for this. The principles of survival were abstract. The reality was the unrelenting ache in her teeth from the cold, the raw chafing of her frozen clothes against her skin, the way her own thoughts began to feel slow and thick, like cold molasses. They spoke little. Words cost energy, and energy was the only currency they had left. Martha, ever practical, used a sharp stone to dig for roots she recognized, her fingers growing numb and clumsy in the frozen earth. She found a few woody, fibrous things. They chewed them slowly, the effort of it exhausting. Their bodies were beginning to fail in specific, clinical ways. The tips of their fingers went from burning to white to a waxy numbness that stopped reporting pain altogether. The world narrowed to a small circle of immediate needs, a little warmth, a mouthful of anything, a moment without shivering. One evening, huddled under the rock ledge as a fine, hard snow began to fall, Martha turned to Abigail. Her face was gaunt, her lips cracked. "We should go back," she whispered, her voice rough. "We can ask Mr. Hemlock for work. We can be maids. Scullery girls. It would be better than this." The thought was a siren's call. The image of a warm kitchen, even one where they were servants, was overwhelmingly seductive. The smell of oatmeal, a food they had always disliked, now seemed like the very essence of paradise. Abigail looked at her sister, saw the surrender in her eyes, and felt the same pull. This was it. This was the place where their story could end, a footnote in the town's history. The Miller girls tried to make it on their own. Found frozen by the creek, she lay in the dark, the cold stone at her back, and considered the simple act of giving up. It would be so easy. Just walk back toward the faint glow of the town and beg. But then, something else surfaced. It was not a grand notion of pride or defiance. It was a sentence from her mother's ledger, a memory of her mother's handwriting, precise and clear. She had been writing about lichens. The bright orange xanthoria grows on rock, but the pale green usnea, the one they call old man's beard, prefers the bark of ancient oaks. It is a sign of clean air and a stable ecosystem. Where you find a thick coat of usnea, you find a place that has been left alone for a long time. The sentence was a small, practical thing. It was a fact. But in the suffocating darkness of their despair, it was a lifeline. It was a problem that demanded attention. It was something to look for. Not yet, Abigail said, her own voice a croak. Tomorrow. We look for old man's beard. We look for a big oak. Martha said nothing, but she didn't argue. A new objective, no matter how small, was better than none. The body sometimes makes a decision before the mind catches up. They had a reason to get up in the morning. The next day, they walked. They crawled more than walked, conserving energy, their eyes scanning the skeletal trees. They saw cottonwoods, ash, a few lonely pines. But no great oaks. The snow fell harder. The world was a canvas of white and grey. By late afternoon, when the light began to fail, they stumbled into a small, sheltered hollow, a depression in the land protected by a high ridge. And there it stood. It was a bur oak, a giant that must have been a sapling when the first explorers passed through this land. It was immense, its trunk wider than 3 men standing shoulder to shoulder. Its lower branches, thick as a man's waist, spread out like sheltering arms. And clinging to its ancient, gnarled bark, were thick, pale green veils of usnea lichen, just as the ledger had described. The tree was alive, but a jagged, dark scar ran up one side, evidence of a lightning strike from long ago. At its base, hidden by a tangle of wild grapevines, was a dark opening. It was a hollow. They approached it slowly, as if approaching a sacred place. Pushing aside the frozen vines, they peered inside. The interior was a cavern, far larger than it had any right to be. The lightning had burned out the heartwood, but the outer layers of the tree, the living part, had healed around the wound, creating a sheltered, wooden cave. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dry, rotted wood pulp and old leaves. It was dark, but it was out of the wind. It was a shelter. Martha crawled inside first. Abigail followed. They sat on the soft, dry floor in the sudden, profound silence. The wind howled outside, but in the heart of the great oak, it was only a distant whisper. The air was still. It smelled of dry earth, of seasons of decay, of life. They did not feel relief, not yet. Relief was an emotion for people who expected to be saved. What they felt was something quieter, something deeper. It was recognition. They dropped to their knees, not in prayer, but in a kind of gravitational pull toward the earth. They had been given nothing by the world of men. But the land, in its vast indifference, had offered them a home. They sat on the cold floor and felt something they had no word for except right. The first task was to make the hollow livable. It was a shelter, but it was not yet a home. The opening was too wide, an invitation to the wind and the cold. They needed a door. For 2 days, they worked, weaving a crude but effective barrier from the thick, frozen grapevines and stuffing the gaps with dried leaves and moss. It was not airtight, but it broke the wind, turning its direct assault into a manageable draft. Inside, the space was roughly circular, about 12 feet across, and tall enough for them to stand upright in the center. The walls were the curved, incredibly thick interior of the living oak. They were hard as iron. The floor of rotted wood pulp, what foresters call hard rot, was dry and insulating. It was a gift. They scraped it into a thick pile on one side for a bed, a deep mattress of organic matter that held their body heat. Fire was the next problem. They had no flint and steel, and their few matches had been ruined by moisture. Abigail remembered a passage in the botany book, not about fire, but about the properties of fungi. It mentioned the tinder fungus, a hard, hoof-shaped growth found on birch trees, which could hold a spark for hours. They had no birch, but Martha, searching the woods, found a similar parleypaw on a dead cottonwood. They gathered it, along with the driest twigs and bark they could find, placing them in a protected corner of the hollow. The problem of creating the initial spark remained unsolved. For now, survival depended on their bodies and the insulation of the tree. They sealed the smaller cracks in the tree's trunk with a mixture of clay from the creek bed and moss, a natural chinking that hardened in the cold. Every calorie was precious. They continued to forage for rose hips and the tough inner bark of pine trees, which could be boiled into a vaguely nutritious, if unpleasant, tea. They set simple snares Martha devised from vines, hoping to catch a rabbit or a squirrel. For a week, the snares remained empty. The psychological weight of isolation began to press on them. The silence inside the tree was absolute, broken only by their own breathing and the frantic beating of their hearts. Days were spent in a near-constant state of labor, gathering wood, hauling clay, searching for food. But the nights were long and dark. In the suffocating blackness of the hollow, fear was a living thing. Every creak of the tree, every distant howl of a coyote, was magnified. They would talk in low whispers, not about their predicament, but about their childhood, reciting their mother's recipes or their father's favorite stories. The memories were a small fire they tended in the darkness. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. During a rare moment of sunshine, Abigail was outside gathering firewood when she noticed something glinting at the base of a rock outcropping. It was a piece of glass, the thick, curved bottom of an old bottle, worn smooth by time. She picked it up. It was a lens. She remembered reading about how a lens could focus sunlight. It was a long shot. The winter sun was weak and low in the sky. They waited for the next clear day. They prepared a small nest of the driest, most flammable material they had, the fibrous inner lining of a milkweed pod, a piece of the tinder fungus, and a few wisps of Martha's own hair. Abigail held the glass lens, angling it, moving it, her numb fingers barely able to grip it. Martha shielded the small nest from the faint breeze. For an hour, nothing happened. The point of light was too weak. Just as they were about to give up, a tiny wisp of smoke curled up from the tinder. It was thinner than a thread. They held their breath. Martha blew on it, a gentle, steady stream of air. The smoke thickened. A tiny, red ember glowed in the heart of the tinder. They transferred the ember to the prepared hearth with the reverence of priests. They fed it the smallest, driest twigs. A flame flickered, hesitated, then caught. It grew. Warmth and light filled the hollow for the first time. They did not celebrate. They sat before the small fire and wept, the tears freezing on their cheeks. It was not just a fire. It was proof. It was the moment they stopped merely enduring and began to build. With fire, everything changed. They could boil water, making it safe to drink. They could make pine bark tea, which staved off the worst of the hunger pangs. The snares finally yielded a small rabbit. They cooked it over the fire, the smell of roasting meat filling their small home, an aroma so rich and promising it felt like a prayer. They ate every last piece, boiling the bones for a thin, nourishing broth. The protein and fat surged through their systems, clearing the fog from their minds. The building became more ambitious. They used their small fire to harden the tips of sticks into crude digging implements. They dug a deeper fire pit and lined it with stones from the creek, creating a hearth that would hold heat for hours. They discovered that the smoke, filtered through a small hole they carefully bored through a thinner part of the trunk, was almost invisible from a distance, a faint grey haze that dissipated in the trees. The first proof of their new life, the thing that signaled a shift from mere survival to something resembling homesteading, grew in the dampest, darkest corner of the hollow. Abigail, studying her mother's ledger by firelight, read a section on cultivating mushrooms. Her mother had experimented with growing oyster mushrooms on damp logs in their root cellar. The ledger described the conditions needed: high humidity, low light, and a substrate of decaying hardwood. They were living inside a substrate of decaying hardwood. They found the distinctive, fan-shaped mushrooms growing on a fallen log near the creek. Following the ledger's instructions, they carefully transferred a piece of the log, rich with the white, thread-like mycelium, into their home. They placed it in a corner and kept it moist with water from the creek. For weeks, nothing happened. Then one morning, Martha noticed a tiny cluster of white pins pushing up from the log. Within days, they had a small but beautiful flush of pale, edible oyster mushrooms. They cooked them with a bit of rabbit fat. The flavor was delicate, earthy, and profoundly satisfying. It was the first thing they had eaten that they had not found, but grown. It was a harvest. A head of pale lettuce in January would have been a miracle. A cluster of mushrooms in the dead of winter, grown inside a tree, felt like a quiet declaration of independence. They were no longer just surviving the winter. They were bending it to their will. An ally arrived not with a helping hand, but with a curious eye. Jedediah was a man who lived at the edges, a trapper and hunter who spent more time in the wilderness than in town. The people of Prairie Ridge saw him as half-wild, a relic from an earlier time. They tolerated him because he provided the best pelts, but they did not understand him. Jedediah, in turn, had little use for their neatly plotted lives. He understood the language of the land, and one day, that language told him something new. He smelled a faint, unfamiliar wood smoke in a part of the woods that should have been empty. He did not approach directly. For 3 days, he watched the great oak from a distance. He saw the 2 young women, moving with a quiet efficiency that he respected. He saw their well-made snares, the careful way they managed their small fire, the insulated door. He was not seeing victims. He was seeing survivors. On the 4th day, he walked into their small clearing, holding up an open hand to show he was no threat. He carried 2 skinned rabbits and a small sack. The sisters froze, fear a cold spike in their chests. But the man's eyes were not unkind. They were simply observant. "Jedediah," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Saw your smoke. Figured you weren't ghosts." Abigail and Martha said nothing. He set the rabbits down. "Trade," he said, pointing to the game. "For a look at whatever you're doing in that tree." Slowly, cautiously, they showed him. He ducked inside the hollow, his large frame filling the space. His eyes missed nothing, the stone hearth, the bed of wood pulp, the neat stacks of firewood. Then he saw the mushroom log. He knelt, touching one of the pale fungi with a calloused finger. A slow smile spread across his weathered face. "Well, I'll be," he murmured. "Never seen that done." He did not offer pity or charity. He offered a transaction between equals. He had salt, a commodity more valuable than gold to them. He had cured hides they could use for blankets and warmer clothes. He had knowledge of the land that went beyond their books. They had a source of fresh food in the dead of winter. The trade was made. Jedediah became their link to the outside world, a world they had no desire to rejoin but could not entirely ignore. He never asked about their past. He only cared about their present competence. He showed Martha how to build a better deadfall trap, one that could catch a raccoon or even a small deer. He taught Abigail how to render fat into tallow for candles and soap. In return, they gave him mushrooms, dried herbs they collected, and the quiet company of people who understood the value of silence. He was the ally they needed, not a rescuer, but a fellow professional who recognized and respected their work. The community's conversion began not with a change of heart, but with an empty stomach. The winter of 1888 was unusually harsh. Snowfall was heavy, and the cold was deep and persistent. Supplies in Prairie Ridge dwindled. The shipments of food from the east were delayed by snowbound rails. Scurvy, the old sailor's plague, began to appear, a slow rot of the gums and a deep ache in the bones caused by a lack of fresh produce. Jedediah, during a rare trip to town, brought a handful of the sisters' oyster mushrooms to the general store, hoping to trade them for ammunition. The storekeeper, a man named Peters, looked at them with suspicion. "What are these?" "Food," Jedediah said. "Fresh." Peters scoffed. Nothing fresh grows in this cold, but he was a desperate man. His own children were showing signs of the sickness. He made the trade. That night, his wife cooked the mushrooms in a thin stew. They were delicious. More than that, they felt nourishing. The town doctor, a young man named Alastair Finch, was at his wits' end. He had poultices and tinctures, but he could not cure malnutrition. He heard the whispers about Jedediah and the strange fungus he'd brought from the woods. Skeptical but desperate, he sought the trapper out. Jedediah, after some persuasion, led him to the great oak. Dr. Finch was a man of science. He did not see two destitute orphans. He saw two brilliant, practical botanists. He saw their cultivation log, their stores of dried yarrow and rose hips. He recognized the intelligence and discipline required to achieve this. He began to trade medical supplies, bandages, antiseptic, quinine for their mushrooms and herbs. He prescribed them to his sickest patients. And slowly, miraculously, the people began to get better. The community did not celebrate the sisters. They did not apologize. They converted quietly, through need. A farmer would leave a sack of flour at the edge of the clearing and return later to find a basket of mushrooms in its place. A woman would leave a bolt of wool cloth and find dried herbs for her child's cough. The sisters became a silent, unseen source of sustenance. They were no longer the town's outcasts. They were its strange, wild gardeners. They had built something the world had been forced to recognize, not out of admiration, but out of sheer, undeniable necessity. By the time the spring thaw finally arrived, they were no longer just surviving. They were thriving, their roots sunk deep into the heart of the ancient oak that had become their home. The late spring of 1889 brought a different kind of sickness to Prairie Ridge. It wasn't a fever or a plague of the body, but a blight on the wheat. A rust-colored fungus spread through the fields, withering the young stalks before they could form heads of grain. The town, which had barely survived the winter, now faced the prospect of a summer famine. Their primary crop, the very thing their economy was built upon, was turning to dust. Mr. Hemlock, the banker, was a man whose world was built on predictable outcomes. He understood interest rates, crop yields, and the rigid logic of contracts. He did not understand blight. He watched the foundation of his town crumble, his certainty eroding with each withered field. His authority, once absolute, now felt hollow. The townspeople looked to him for answers, but his ledgers held none. Then his wife, Eleanor, fell ill. It was not the blight, but a wasting sickness that left her weak and unable to keep down food. Dr. Finch did what he could, but Eleanor faded. One evening, the doctor sat with a diminished and desperate Mr. Hemlock in his parlor. "She needs nourishment," Dr. Finch said, his voice low. "Simple, easily digestible nourishment. The kind of thing the Miller sisters grow." The name hung in the air between them. Mr. Hemlock looked smaller than Abigail and Martha remembered. The starched collar of his shirt seemed too large for his neck. The hardness in his eyes had gone soft in the wrong direction, replaced by the dull sheen of fear. He had spent his life accumulating assets, and now the one thing he could not bear to lose was slipping through his fingers. The next morning, he made the journey to the woods. He did not ride his fine horse. He walked, the humility of the act a form of penance. He found the great oak, now surrounded by a small, thriving garden plot where the sisters were cultivating hardy greens and root vegetables. They were no longer gaunt and shivering. They were strong, their movements economical and sure. He stood at the edge of the clearing, a man out of his element. Abigail and Martha stopped their work and watched him. They waited. He did not offer an apology. He did not speak of the past. His pride would not allow it. He simply asked for what he needed. "My wife is ill," he said, his voice tight. The doctor said. "He said you might have something she can eat. I will pay whatever you ask." The power in the clearing had reversed completely. They held what he needed, and he had nothing to offer but money, a currency that had lost its meaning in this small kingdom of their own making. Martha looked at Abigail. Abigail looked back at Mr. Hemlock, at this man who had cast them out with a single, legal phrase. She did not see an enemy. She saw a husband, afraid of losing his wife. Her response was not emotional. It was logistical. "What are her symptoms?" Abigail asked. He described them. Abigail nodded, already running through an inventory of their herbs and produce in her mind. "We have a mushroom broth," she said. and a tea from the inner bark of the elm. It will soothe her stomach. We can give you enough for 3 days. She turned to Martha, who was already moving toward their small, outdoor kitchen. They did not gloat. They did not demand an apology before helping. The wisdom was entirely in the action. They simply addressed the need that stood before them. Mr. Hemlock paid the price they asked, a fair price, the same price anyone else would pay. As he turned to leave, his hands full, he hesitated. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished object. It was their mother's silver locket. He had taken it from the house, claiming it was part of the estate auction. He said nothing. He simply placed it on a tree stump, turned, and walked away. It was not a full apology. It was a partial acknowledgement, a return of something that had cost him nothing to take, but something of his pride to give back. It was as close to amends as a man like him could come. They never spoke of it again. The broth and tea helped Eleanor. She recovered. The town, with the sisters' guidance on crop rotation and heartier, blight-resistant vegetables they had cultivated from their mother's seeds, survived the summer. Abigail and Martha lived for another 50 years. They never left the oak. They expanded their home, not by cutting into the living tree, but by building around it, a collection of small, clever structures that leaned against the great trunk, as if in conversation with it. Their home became a place of learning. They taught anyone who came with an open mind, young wives who wanted to learn about herbs, farmers struggling with bad soil, children curious about the names of the wildflowers. They fed hundreds of people through 2 more hard winters and a drought in the early 1900s. They never married. Their partnership was complete. Martha died first, in the autumn of her 68th year. She passed in a chair on the small porch they had built, a basket of late-season apples in her lap. Abigail lived another 3 years, her mind as sharp as ever, her mother's ledger now filled with her own precise handwriting. She died in her bed inside the hollow of the tree, a cup of mint tea still warm on the table beside her. From outside, you could hear the sound of one of her students, a young woman from the town, turning the soil in the garden, continuing the work. They were buried together at the foot of the great oak. The town put up a simple stone marker. It did not list their names. It just said, they fed people. There is a place inside you that the world has told you is uninhabitable. A gift they called a fault. A passion they dismissed as a waste of time. You have been standing outside the door to that place for a long time, perhaps holding a key you were told was useless. You have been told that the law of the world has no room for what you are. But the wilderness of your own soul operates under a different law. It is waiting for you to recognize it, not as a place of exile, but as the one place you were always meant to build your home. The mother's ledger was more than a book of observations. It was a map, left by someone who knew that the most important things are rarely written in the ledgers of men. True shelter is not a structure built by others, but a space you make from what you know. If you found value in their story, subscribe to this channel for more histories of quiet resilience.